Hello, thank you for joining us today. Glad you could be here for our session, Transform Your Negotiation and Leadership Skills. Before we get started, my name is Mark Sharp. I'm the Director of Marketing with Red Bear Negotiation, and I just wanted to cover a couple of things for housekeeping really quick. So first, this recording will be available on demand after today's session. And please feel free to submit your questions anytime throughout our session. We'll be doing Q&A throughout and at the end of the session as questions appear. And then also, if you could, at the end of today's session, if you could provide us feedback on what you thought of today's session, that helps us in planning for future sessions. So with that, why don't we get started? Let me tell you a little bit about who we are. Red Bear Negotiation is a global performance improvement firm that's dedicated to maximizing the profitability of the agreements negotiated with suppliers, customers, partners, and colleagues. Our consultants work in over 15 different languages and have delivered our workshops globally in North and South America, Asia, Europe, Africa, and Australia. So what do we do? In short, Red Bear Negotiation transforms people, teams, and organizations into world-class negotiators. Our work helps organizations reduce costs, increase profitability, manage risk, increase internal alignment, and support the achievement of critical corporate goals. Our hallmark programs are situational negotiation skills, negotiating with suppliers, and cross-cultural negotiations. Well, how do we do it? We have a hallmark blend of custom-tailored workshops that are designed around client-specific scenarios that help us understand the daily scenarios that your negotiators work in. And we deliver our own patented discovery-based learning approach, which gives our participants a blend of metaphorical and custom-tailored negotiation work exercises to help drive that home. And that's what we'll be talking a lot about today. I'd like to welcome Krisztina Lorinczi with me today to present, and I'd like to describe Krisztina with 3 numbers, okay? So those numbers are 21, 35, and 5. So Krisztina has been a facilitator and instructor for over 21 years. She has delivered in 35 different countries and speaks 5 different languages. So Krisztina, thank you so much for being with us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And in today's session, I'm really excited about the topic of transformation because that's something that's so core to Red Bear Negotiation. And I'm looking forward to getting into, what that looks like, how it helps, how that takes place. So thanks a lot for being here with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark, for having me here. And I love your initial question, but before I jump into that, let me share 3 words with our wonderful audience, and then I'm going to ask a question related to these 3 expressions. Let me write them down on the flip chart. So the first word is gym. The second one is workshop. And the third one is car wash. Ladies and gentlemen, what do these expressions have in common? And you can type your answer so that we can hear what you think about it. So, meanwhile you think about what these expressions have in common, I'm sure you have some ideas. So, if you think about, if you go to the gym once and then you go home, you look at yourself in the mirror, and if you expect a huge change, you might be disappointed, right? Now, if someone goes to a workshop, it's a 2-day program, and afterwards thinks, you know what, I'm a completely different person. I'm proud of my new behaviors. I have completely different new patterns. Might be a little disappointing because just a 2-day workshop won't have such a big change in the life of anyone. What about a car wash? it's important sometimes to bring our cars to the car wash, right? You look at the car, it looks beautiful, but you cannot expect after washing your car, even in the best place, that your engine was looked after, that the brake pads were checked, right? So what do these words have in common? They are important. It's an intervention. It's something crucial, but they want bring a transformational change. So if we want to define what is a transformational change, then we can say it's a long-lasting impact on what? Behaviors, patterns that we use, habits. It's a developmental journey of skills.
I love that, Krisztina. One thing that is really kind of strikes me about those three words is that it's good intentions, right? And it's good to be doing those things, but similarly, if you were to go to training, it's a good thing, but it's not enough. And so, what is that difference between just going to training versus going through a transformational change? You mentioned a journey. So how does that journey kind of help somebody, the steps of those journey, how does that help somebody go through that transformation?
So first of all, I love that you brought up the word intention, Mark, and let me stay here for a minute, because a lot of times we can say intention doesn't equal impact, right? We have the best intention. Yeah, some sales managers or purchasing managers are sending their team members to a workshop. So the intention is great, but what is the impact? Impact is that participants, if the workshop is great, they are impressed, right? For a few days, but then the impact fades away. So it's not enough. Now, if you're thinking about a transformational journey, how does it help? It helps participants to really achieve a change in their behaviors, in the way they approach a conversation with their counterparts.
That's great. So one other aspect of that difference too, and I wonder, I'm sure you're familiar with this, is that journey is just as it's not always what is taught, it's also how it's taught, right? And so we think about those results from research that shows retention over time from a traditional training is roughly around like 5% maybe, but the retention through experiential learning or engaged learning is really as high as 90%. And so that's an important factor that I think is key to highlight too, is that process. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, that process of, it's not always just what you teach, but it's also how you teach it. Right. Yeah. So why don't we talk a little bit about what that looks like, from an instructor's point of view and also from a participant's point of view, is that how is material taught in a way that leads to that transformational change?
I love that question. And you highlighted the two main aspects. One is the what, and let's talk about that afterwards then, and the how. So from an instructor's point of view, I'm so passionate, probably you can see it, I'm so passionate about that topic, because I think the how is a very important topic here. Now, I'm a big fan of discovery-based learning, experiential learning. Now, what does it mean? Participants, when they arrive to a workshop, most of them have their question marks. So of course, first we have to create a safe space of learning. They have to feel like in a nest. They have to feel like, yeah, it's good to open up here. We are in a safe environment where we can test our skills and we can make mistakes. So participants are doing exercises that are sometimes metaphorical. So metaphorical negotiation scenarios, role plays. In those, they can test their skills. And they don't really have to do anything with their daily job. Why? And maybe we can involve our wonderful audience and you can put your answers there. So why do you think it's better sometimes to have these metaphorical, abstract cases that don't have to do anything with the daily challenges of participants, of negotiators? And meanwhile, you're typing your thoughts. Let me share this with you. So, and in the last 21 years, I've seen so many, and I've experienced so many different negotiation programs and leadership journeys, that my conclusion is when they run a role play around a metaphorical case, they don't have excuses, objections why something is not working out. The case is neutral for everyone, so they can really test their own skills, how they approach a negotiation. So participants really like from it. And at the same time, let me call it, it's edutaining. What I mean by edutaining, it's they learn, so it's educational. And at the same time, it's entertaining because the cases are also fun in a certain way. They are challenging their mind, and they have to step out of their comfort zone, of course, in a safe environment.
Yeah, Krisztina, we had somebody, they were typing as you were speaking. And so it came through as that it frees up the mind to think of solutions unconstrained from the limitations we are accustomed to. I mean, that's perfectly worded, isn't it? I mean, that's exactly the point of that, is to really kind of test your existing skills and see where it gets you. You know, it brings out, and it's fun in workshops watching people engage in those metaphorical scenarios, because they get competitive and they start to like really get into it. And you know, that before and after, you know, what they think when they go into that negotiation, and then what they're thinking afterwards, especially when debriefing happens, they start to question and analyze, you know, and consider what it is that they bring to these scenarios when they're just reacting. And that's an important part, isn't it?
And you inspired me to share something, Mark, which is one of my absolute favorite topics, which is self-limiting beliefs. I mean, if we are honest to ourselves, we all have our self-limitations, and participants can break out of those in these metaphorical scenarios. Like if I ask you to think about what is a belief system that you have, that you've grown into, that you want to put down one day, right? So we have participants to break down the walls, and it's extremely exciting to see that after the first role play that they play, they come up with excuses why something is not relevant for their work. But then, of course, great facilitators are very comfortable with this. No, it's not working. No, in our work, no, in our work life, that's not like that, right? So we have them to open up, to feel free, to understand their limitations, and we have them to get closer to new patterns and habits. But of course, the process is important as well, because if the workshop is great, but it's only a workshop, it's like a movie. You go to see a movie, you feel great that night, and then in a few days, the whole thing fades away. And let me ask you, and let me involve you here. I want this to be a conversation. Have you ever been in a program, in a workshop, where you thought, wow, that facilitator was great? And then if you ask yourself honestly, did it result in any behavioral change just because you attended a 1 or a 2 day program, even if it was wonderful and you loved that experience? Maybe you have been in such a situation, right? So it's not just the how, but it's also about the what. It's also about the process. It's also about the steps.
Well, I think the important part also is that combination of that metaphorical to kind of trigger that self-reflection, right? And then also how then it moves into the actual, you know, like client-focused or custom-tailored scenarios, which, you know, with Red Bear, we build that around. We do a lot of work ahead of workshops in order to understand that scenario that's going on, so that we can create these exercises that then puts those participants, now that they've thought about another way that they could go about it, it puts them into that scenario to then test and, apply that and test it. And so,
Absolutely.
that those two pieces of it, that going back to your example of a movie, is that movies might be very entertaining, but when they cause you to think and reflect and like, what would I do in that situation? And then you get to kind of find yourself in that situation. That's when some of those things really stick with people. And so that's really one of those objectives, right? So,
Yes.
So we've talked a little bit about the how, and then also from an instructor's standpoint. Talk to us a little bit about that, how an instructor actually helps a participant kind of work through that transformation, whether it's through the debriefing or how they introduce these topics and stuff, and why it is that it's laid out the way that it is.
Mm-hmm. So you want me to go deeper into the how, Mark? You want to share my secrets, the top secrets of how to facilitate programs? Okay.
Maybe in broad strokes. We don't want to give everything away, right?
Of course, like if I had to give you a list about all the things we do as facilitators to engage with participants, I mean, once I created a list, and I think I came up with 45 different tools that I use to make sure everybody's involved. Just to mention the first and most important step, it sounds like not that important, but in the virtual world, and we all have been working a lot online now since COVID started, right? So for me, the rule number one is everybody has to switch on the camera if we work on a platform in a workshop. So that's the rule. That's the rule number one. And then of course, in the role plays, I also make sure that participants are not just talking about the case, because sometimes participants like to avoid the uncomfortable parts of really going into the role play and playing it and running the conversations. So as facilitators, carefully we walk into their rooms in a face-to-face environment. We sit down next to them in the virtual world. We visit them in the breakout rooms and see if they are really running it. Of course, we have to be very assertive with them, but also using our emotional intelligence is extremely important so that they feel safe and they know there is no mistake in a workshop. And of course, engaging with them, talking to them directly. So for example, this is my magic, okay? Don't share it with anyone else outside this webinar. So I have a magic wand. This is a super special Harry Potter wand. So if nobody is volunteering for an answer, I pick someone right from the screen, and then they don't see it as a wow, why me? But they are smiling and they take this much easier. So involvement, talking to them is extremely important. And I have a rule for myself. I don't allow myself to share a concept longer than 5 minutes. That's my rule, because people's attention span is getting shorter and shorter. So we have to be concise. So these were just a few things, but of course, the summary is discovery-based learning, and in other words, self-reflection, helping participants to come to their own conclusions and learning from what they have experienced is extremely important instead of telling them what to do.
You touched on an important point that I wanted to kind of anchor back to, is that whether it is keeping the camera on or picking somebody from the crowd, it's all about that engagement, because naturally we're kind of hardwired to seek comfort, right? And some of these scenarios that we find ourselves in can really kind of make us uncomfortable, or we talk about tension all the time with Red Bear, right? So we've talked a lot about the how we go about trying to facilitate that transformation, and of course, those methods are effective, but it's also about the what that we're teaching, right? And so on that topic of tension, why don't we spend a little bit of time talking about that and how this process helps to get people comfortable with the uncomfortable.
I love that, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. Yes, as you mentioned, there is a process. A process is absolutely necessary for transformational change. And in the process, of course, there are also workshops. And in the workshops, what do participants do? They experience different activities, and they also learn some tools, some techniques. They receive some guidance, and they learn about so-called, and I love this expression, they learn some counterintuitive tools. What do I mean by counterintuitive tools? These are tools that feel like uncomfortable, as you mentioned, Mark, right? And the participants think, no, that's not the right way. And let me ask you, you can put it in the chat. So what do you think is a counterintuitive tool? And meanwhile, you put there your answers. What is something where you would say, I should do it even though my gut feeling tells me not to do, but this might be the right way. So as you, Mark, mentioned, it's about the tension, right? People like to avoid conflicts. I mean, put up your hand if you don't disagree with me, right? So we like to avoid conflict in lives. We want to have peace. We don't want tension, but tension is an important counterintuitive tool. Now, let me use my flip chart to explain you one of my absolute favorite tools in Red Bear's negotiation workshops. And if my friends tell me, Chris, you're a negotiation and a leadership trainer, I mean, if I give you 2 minutes, what is your favorite model? That's what I'm going to explain to you, okay? So I'd like to encourage you to grab a sheet of paper and you could draw along with me, because I'm explaining to you a concept that can be used both in your private life and also in business context. And this theory is called the tension model. It's a three-dimensional model that basically explains how every complicated or less complicated negotiation can be seen. Okay, so as I mentioned to you, it's a triangle model. So let us start with drawing a triangle. And as I mentioned to you, I would recommend that you draw along with me, because then you remember the concept also afterwards. Let me just change the camera setting a bit. So the three corners of the triangle illustrate the three basic elements of every negotiation. Now, if you think about it, in every negotiation, you have your own interest, yeah? You have certain targets for yourself. You have your own goals. Let's call it self-interest, and let us write it down in the left corner. So these are your own goals in your negotiations, right? We call it also the competitive aspect of every negotiation. You can write it down. Competitive, right? So the other key component of every negotiation is what? The opposite of your own interest. So these are the interests of your counterpart, the interest of the others. So let us write it down, the interest of the others. Or of the other side. We also call this component the relationship aspect, because you have the competitive aspect, yourself, your goals, your targets, your needs. And then here, you also have to pay attention to the relationship to the others. So what happens in every negotiation? Of course, you have your interest and the other party has also its interest. So what happens between the two? You can put it in the chat if you want. What happens between the two there is, if it's not an easy case, and let's not talk about easy cases today, right? It starts with a T. So what is between the two? There is, Mark mentioned this expression a lot of times, tension, right? So every smart and wise negotiator knows that this is a counterintuitive behavior, counterintuitive approach to stay in the tension. But of course, everyone wants to achieve what? Everyone wants to achieve a breakthrough. And how that can be achieved is through creativity. Now, if you think about it, every complex and complicated negotiation might start at the beginning here, People are polite to each other, they respect each other, they are listening. But the more time goes by, they are focused on their own interest. They get caught in the trap of their own interest. And only if they start again listening to each other, asking open-ended questions, right? Repeating what is important to the others, summarizing from time to time what was achieved until that moment, only then through some creativity, some new ideas that have not been there before can breakthrough be achieved. So when you're negotiating the next time, or when you're planning a negotiation, ask yourself, is the whole triangle covered? Do you know what your own interests are? Are you listening to the needs and expectations of the other party? Could you list their needs? And is there any creative idea, or are both parties just stuck at this bottom level of the triangle? Mark, it's to you.
We've got a question for the audience, right? So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll question. And it's what aspect of negotiation do you find most difficult, right? Is it protecting your own self-interest? Is being competitive difficult for you? Or is it being collaborative? Is seeing the other side of the view? Is that what's more difficult for you? Or is it understanding how to get yourself out of a deadlock, being creative? Is that a difficult process for you? So we've got that poll open for about 30 more seconds. And I will say that I think one of the things that's most difficult for me is being collaborative, really, is that sometimes I get a little bit, it's easy for me to maintain focus on my own self-interests, that sometimes honestly I get lost trying to see the other side, the perspective of the other person. And so being collaborative sometimes is really difficult for me, and trying to employ those habits that work is something that's difficult for me. So
absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. And so it looks like being competitive, about a quarter of our audience felt that being competitive was the most difficult aspect of negotiation for them.
So
yeah, a quarter said it was, we were getting a little bit of change here, some last minute tabulation. So about 33%, about a third of our audience had difficulty being competitive, and only 16% had difficulty being collaborative. But 50% of our audience found the most difficult aspect of negotiation for them was being creative, was finding that breakthrough. So
what was the percentage for creativity?
50%.
50%. Okay. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So what I see in the beautiful metaphorical role plays also is that really stopping and summarizing what was achieved until now, and what are your needs, what is really important for you. So asking open-ended questions and then staying in the silence. Some people find it really hard because they find silence should be filled. Yeah, so this is a counter-intuitive approach. A lot of people have difficulty with that. So I have to remind them in the workshop, okay, what could you do differently? How could you learn about the needs of the other party, right? But of course, it depends on the situation. It depends also on the age, right? So some people say at a younger age, competitive aspect is easier than the collaborative one, and it might change through our lives.
So we've talked a little bit about the model, and in that process, we've talked about some of the individual principles. And so why don't we, I've got a slide that kind of puts all of those together. Why don't we take a look at that, and maybe you could, maybe what you could do is walk us through some of these individually. But why don't we start with just talking about all six and list those for everybody and just refresh everybody's memory if they're familiar with these. And then let's go into each one of those and talk about how each one of those, what the transformational step is, kind of what the key mistake is that people typically make, and then what they've got to learn to do to become better at that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I would encourage you to make notes because these are I live my life based on these principles. Since I learned them, my life has changed. I have two teenagers, a 16-year-old daughter and an 18-year-old boy. And actually, they have learned this too. And I'm so happy, knock on wood, we have such a wonderful relationship. So I use this in my business and also business life, and also with my beloved ones. So if you could go back to the list, Mark, that would be wonderful. Yeah, so position your case advantageously is the first principle. And of course, participants learn this through experiential learning. So it's not like we are showing them, okay, learn that and then share it, yeah, say it back to us. So they experience it through the role plays, and us facilitators, we are asking questions, and they come up with these rules for themselves as we go. So setting high targets, as high aspirations is rule number 2. Manage information skillfully, super important. I will come back to that in a second. Know the full strengths and range of power. Yeah, an underestimated principle of negotiations. Satisfy needs over wants. Maybe you're wondering what that means. I will explain it in a second. And concede according to plan is the next one. Now, I'm going to give you a short summary of all these 6 principles. And as Mark mentioned it, I'm going to share the biggest mistakes related to them. Maybe that might be the most exciting way for me to explain it. So the first one is position your case advantageously. Now, what does it mean in a simple way of expressing it? I like to phrase it the following way. I like to say, describe your case, describe your product, describe what you're talking about in a way that brings advantages to you. I mean, let me ask you, how many times has it happened to you in your life that your counterpart was speaking, and was not able to bring his or her case across? You didn't even understand what the person wanted to share with you. Does it happen to you? Just put a yes or a no in the chat if you can. Does it happen that somebody is speaking to you in a way that you don't understand their case? So in the workshop, they are learning how to be brief, compelling, and repeatable, how they can position what they are describing in a short way so that the counterpart is able to remember it the next day as well. Why is that important? That the counterpart is able to repeat it. Because a lot of people are involved in the decision-making process nowadays. Between 5 and 7 people have to say yes to a case, so that there can be a signature on a contract. So positioning in a compelling way, there should be a title and 3 key subtopics mentioned so that the other part is able to digest and take away the most critical parts. So the biggest mistake here is not being able to be concise and brief. The second one is setting high targets, setting high aspirations. Yeah, frame or to be framed. If you can go back to that, Mark, I can share a word about that. Yeah, so the question is if you can frame your case in an advantageous way, or will the counterpart be more successful and will frame you in a way that is weakening your position, is weakening your negotiation power. Thank you, Mark. So what about setting high aspirations? What we see through discovery-based learning and through the wonderful role plays and cases and scenarios, that is that participants don't dare to be brave to set higher targets and aspirations. Or if they do, they only think about one topic. Let me ask you, what do you think is the one topic every negotiator is putting into the focus? And then they complain that the negotiation is only about that one topic. What is that? It's price, right? But setting high aspirations is not just about price, it's about every negotiable, every component of the negotiation. So we teach participants to think outside the box, being counterintuitive, and dare to set higher targets so that they have some room for concessions. So let me move to the next one. And I know our time is limited. I could talk hours and days about each of these principles. Now, this is, to be honest with you, my favorite right now. This is my favorite principle because so many things can go wrong if this principle is not managed well. So it's called manage information skillfully. What do I mean by that? It's like a three-legged stool. In every negotiation, in every conversation, you have to uncover information. What does it mean in other terms? You have to ask questions, understand the other side. We already talked about asking open-ended questions to understand the needs of the other party, right? So few people are great in asking questions. They think they do, but then their questions are, to a big extent, closed-ended questions. They ask several questions at once without waiting that the counterpart is answering. They are not able to stand the silence, to stay in the silence, to stay in the tension. These are typical mistakes. The second leg is called protect. So if you are a very friendly person, very forthcoming, you might give away in pieces of information that you should protect. So ask yourself, what is really what you want to share and what is something that you should not share because it might weaken your position. And the third one is leverage. So what is something that you really want to share because it makes you strong? What is something that you want to share and highlight because it puts you into a better position? And as you can read here, again, coming back to uncover high performers, best negotiators ask 2.5 times more questions and only speak 1/3 of the time. You can ask yourself, how much do you speak? How many questions do you ask? Before you go into a negotiation, do you write down your questions? Do you plan them? Because what I see as a coach and as a negotiation and leadership trainer is that most of the people don't write down their questions before. So that's my piece of advice for today. The fourth principle is, and if you could move to the next slide, thank you, Mark. Know the full strengths and range of power. Have a list of what makes you powerful. So for example, self-confidence, having a great level of assertiveness, understanding what is the organization that is behind me that can support me in the preparation time. So high performance, understand what sources of power they have, and they are ready to compensate the lacking sources of power. So a biggest mistake here related to this one is not preparing that, not thinking about that principle ahead of time before the negotiation is happening. The fifth principle is called satisfy needs over wants. So one is something that the counterpart is expressing. A need is more general, subjective, and less quantifiable. So only if you ask open-ended questions will you understand what are the underlying needs, right? So, for example, this just came to my mind, like if a kid really wants to have attention, right? So they are asking for a chocolate or for something crazy. Meanwhile, they just want to have attention. They want that the parent is sitting down and just listening to them and praising them, right? So a want is the surface. Yeah, I want that. Yeah, I want a better price. I want discount, or I want this volume. Meanwhile, there is something underlying, maybe even a personal need that somebody wants to show to his or her boss that he or she is doing a wonderful job. I could talk hours about this, but I know our time is running. So the last one is about concessions. Now, there are two big mistakes people commit. Let's say 1+2. One is not planning their concessions. And in the workshop, they learn about concession patterns. And the main mistake is concede too quickly because they think they can win the contract if they concede, if they give in, or they concede. What's the second mistake? Let me ask you. Conceding too quickly and too much, right? In too big chunks. So again, it's a counterintuitive behavior to slow down the concession process. Now, we have a wonderful question for you, which is, why do concessions have So what are typical difficulties with concessions? And I think we have a poll question related to that, Mark, right?
Yeah, so I just launched that question. And so it is, why do most negotiators have difficulty with concessions? And so the answers for your choosing are too focused on getting to yes, just getting a deal. You're afraid of tension. That could be the thing that's most difficult for you. Or for negotiators. A lack of planning, as we've talked about, is just not having a game plan, and an unwillingness to lose, or being unwilling to lose and not wanting to give in anything. So that leads to stalemates. So that is going to be open for a few more seconds, and we'll see what it is. Again, with me, I think it should come as no surprise. I think some of the things that's most difficult for me is being unwilling to lose. But I'm not most negotiators, so we'll see what the group thinks of what most negotiators have difficulty with. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end that poll now. We've got a couple of early responses. It looks like 2/3 are unwilling to lose, and 1/3 is from a lack of planning. So these numbers might change a little bit, but that's where we kind of line up. Okay, so we've got a little bit of difference here. We've got 57% now. I think this is final. 57% are unwilling to lose. 28% believe that most negotiators have a difficulty because of a lack of planning. And then 14% are because they're afraid of tension. And so they kind of give in because they don't want to kind of get into the uncomfortableness.
Very good. And we also have another question related to manage information skillfully. We have time for that. I would love to include that question.
Yeah, so I just launched that, and that'll be open here for a little over a minute. So when managing information, what is the most difficult for you, right? So is it protecting information and knowing how to kind of steer away from those tough probing questions from the other side? Or is it sharing or leveraging information, is knowing what information to kind of share with the other party? Or is it, as you said, asking those open questions, uncovering information? So what is it that is most difficult for you? And so we've got a little bit more time while this is open. And Krisztina, I'm curious, as an expert negotiator yourself, is there an aspect that you have the most difficulty with, or that you've traditionally had difficulty with, that you had to kind of transform yourself to overcome?
I still have to be very conscious when I am in a difficult negotiation, by telling myself this is totally normal. I shouldn't rush through the process. I have to feel I'm marinated a bit in the situation. So I still would like to escape out of that conflict. And that happens most of the times in my private life. When there is a conflict, I really dislike it. So I have to tell myself, Chris, it's a very natural thing to have the tension. Ask a few more open-ended questions. By the way, the question, and coming back to the business world, like a lot of people like to ask at the end of a presentation, do you have any questions? So for me, that's not a question, right? Because it's a closed-ended one and it's not involving the other party. So yeah, the magic of questions is for sure one of my key and favorite topics.
So I closed that poll just a little bit ago, and we've had time for the answers to kind of settle in. 55% of our audience said that uncovering information is what is most difficult for them. So
Absolutely.
what your answer, yeah. And then 44% said that protecting information was most difficult for them. So I think what that also says is that all of us have no problem whatsoever in sharing information.
Absolutely, yeah. And so because I see uncovering information is so important, let me share with you my absolute favorite question type, which is just for you, which is a scaling question. So if you ask your counterpart on a scale from 1 to 10, how important is this topic for you, right? So why is a scaling question on a scale from 1 to 10 great? Because very quickly you get a clear picture about the other party, right? Meanwhile, if you would just ask how important it is, if the other party says important, what is it? A 5, a 7, a 10? You're making assumptions, and as we know, assumptions can kill the results of a negotiation.
That's great. That's a very good insight. I think that a lot of people could put that to use rather than just, is there any more questions? So this has been fantastic. So we've covered, as we said, the how we help transform, what we help transform with. So why don't we talk a little bit about what is the benefit of that transformation, both for the individual and for the organization? So why invest in this skills development exercise? So what is it that we're after, and what does that benefit look like?
The reason I'm passionate about transformational change, both in the world of negotiations and as a leadership trainer, is because it has a great impact for all the three levels, for the individual. Why? Because they can see a behavioral change. Their life is getting easier and they can achieve better results. It also impacts the business unit level, because if everyone or most of the people in the same business unit attend the same journey, the same workshop, they speak the same language, they can bring their skills to a higher level, and it will have an impact. It is having an impact on the results of that given business unit. And of course, it has an impact on the organization. And what is important at a corporate level for every organization? It's growth, cutting costs, mitigating risks. It's also about employee satisfaction and customer satisfaction. So these are most of the times the key corporate goals. And the great transformational change has an impact on all these levels.
That's great. So that impact is so important, and we look at, part of that transformation process from our standpoint is, it takes place in that workshop, right? But then it also needs to extend beyond that as well, right? So we've got reinforcement exercises, coaching built into it, right? And we've got even measurement to help then analyze independently what those results look like. And that's all part of the process. And so that process, it really seems as though that's a key element of it, right? We've talked about the process and the content. So
absolutely.
Yeah, why don't we talk a little bit more about, how that process kind of plays itself out over the lifetime, to really cement that lasting behavior change and make that transformation kind of stick, if you will.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So yeah, absolutely. So I believe that every program and every journey has to be tailor-made. So it's extremely important to to learn the needs, understand the needs of every customer. So every program has to have some tailor-made elements, tailor-made role plays and components in it. And then of course there is a workshop taking place, and then the reinforcement element is extremely important. So what is happening after the workshop? It can be expressed and done in different ways. So for example, if purchasing or sales managers of the organizations are coaching their team members who attended the program, or there can be other reinforcement elements as coaching as well. So that's what I see in Red Bear's negotiation programs as well, and in my leadership development program also.
That's great. So there's a lot of parallel then, it sounds like, in the work that you do between, whether it's helping that transformation take place with negotiation skills or or when it's with leaders, right? So that process has to really start with kind of understanding who you're working with. It has to move into kind of a custom tailoring to really key in on those important features that they need to work on or kind of practice and get better at. And then it's also just having those pieces over time to help them stay on that path, rather than going that traditional model of just sitting down for a session, walking out, and that's it. It's really important that process takes place, and that's similar in your work as well.
Absolutely. So let me share a slide with you that can show how this process is reflected in my work as a leadership trainer. So as you can see, it's a spiral consisting of different steps. And Mark, if you could bring in the different steps, at the same time, that's fine. So I don't want to go into a lot of details, but what you see is we start. So Happy Lounge, Happy is the name of my program, Leadership Potential Accelerator. It starts with exploring the needs and exploring the key most important leadership competencies of our clients. And then there are several steps in the spiral. And what you see, the gray spiral in the background shows that a year after the process, the whole development restarts. So the whole process is not just happening at once, but then there is a next step. So we are bringing our participants in the Leadership Potential Accelerator program to a higher level through different steps in the process that starts with exploring and understanding the leadership components that are important for our customer, for the given customer. And maybe I move to the next slide and share with you. So these are some typical topics that our customers like to choose from, some leadership competencies. And then, Mark, if you could move, click more, because then we can show our wonderful audience that the customer can pick 3 to 5 leadership competencies, and we build up our journey based on their needs, based on the selected leadership competencies, and all that is reflected throughout the spiral. So just a quick reminder, and maybe Mark, we can move to the last slide. Yeah, so here you see the components being built. Yeah, so here at a glance, you see that it's a process. So even though Red Bear's negotiations process is different, but we both represent the philosophy of process, that a process is needed. Because going back to what we started our webinar with, intention is not enough. Intention does not equal impact. Even the best intention can mean money thrown out of the window, time wasted, if it's not embedded in a process. That's what Red Bear and my company is also representing with passion.
Yeah, that's great. It actually, I think I've got a slide here. I do. It's very similar to Red Bear's process, where you start with the discovery and work through all of these things. And it's meant to, again, the timeframes are a little bit different. And the work that we do is a little bit different, but the end result is that it's not just kind of a one session exposure to these things. That transformation, as we've been talking about, it's a process. It's something that takes time. It's something that has distinct stages, right? There's a period of reflection. There's a period of testing and trying things on, and then learning what you're good at, but then having to go through that process again and learning, okay, well, now that I've got this sorted out, maybe now, now that I'm asking open questions and I'm getting better at that, maybe now I need to make sure that I'm thinking about the needs and wants, getting down to the needs and working past the wants.
Absolutely. These are counterintuitive behaviors. They won't be changed from one day to the other. My leadership program, the Leadership Potential Accelerator, so the spiral that you saw, that takes place over 4 months. That's credible. That makes sense. But a workshop can be great fun, but the impact, I have some doubts.
Yeah. That's great. Well, thanks so much for sharing that all with us. We've had a few questions come in, and I think maybe it makes sense to, judging on our time, maybe address 1 or 2 of these here real quick. But I think one of the questions that the audience has, there's a couple, I'm going to kind of paraphrase this into one, is, and it gets to that notion of coaching, is that when you identify those areas that you need help with and say, you're in the workshop, you're going through those negotiation exercises, you're identifying, oh, okay, asking open questions, that's something I didn't realize I had a problem with. What helps a person the most? What's most helpful to help them kind of get through that transformation, as opposed to just kind of hitting a wall and stopping there? What helps them kind of break through that?
Let me use your word, breakthrough questions, right? So instead of talking and preaching and telling them, that's what you have to do, I have 21-year experience, forget about it, right? Ask a question. For example, a comparative question. How would option A or option B impact the results of your negotiations? And then silence, right? Asking people open-ended, thought-generating questions. By the way, I am a life and a business coach, super passionate about it. How can I achieve behavioral change? And how can people have a happier life. Just before the webinar, I received a message from a life coaching client saying, I am so happy I achieved it. I could get rid of being part of my parents' company. That's what I was aiming for 20 years, and now I did it, right? So what did I do? Nothing. I was in the background. I asked a few questions so that the person can come to a self-reflection, to a higher level of self-awareness. That's all. Easy.
That's great. That's an interesting twist on that, is that coaching, right? And whether we have that with a coach like yourself, or whether we have that with a manager or a supervisor or something, teaching them the skills as well to ask open questions, to get the other person talking and to get a little bit deeper. That's all about, managing that information skillfully, is really, is that transformation. When somebody hits a wall with those questions, they just haven't made it all the way through that process. So what helps them? Ask them some questions, get them thinking, maybe a little bit more reflection, maybe a little bit more testing. And so that's
Absolutely.
great.
And I just would like to clarify the definition of coaching, because some people use coaching for feedback, but the classical definition of coaching is asking self-generating questions so that the coachee, the counterpart, can come to some insights that will accelerate their self-development. So feedback does not equal coaching, even though people like to mix those expressions.
Well, even in, instruction too, sometimes we think, like in a sports setting, right? A coach sometimes tells the participant what to do, the athlete, what to do it this way, and that's teaching, but that's not coaching. Coaching helps them understand why and when, and helps them sort those out. So that's great. That's great. I mean, that's an important clarification to make.
Any other questions?
No, I think that kind of clears it up, and we are heading close to our time too. So I want to be mindful of everyone's time. But Krisztina, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it. And to our audience, I hope that you enjoyed today's session and learned a lot from it. And please feel free to join us in future sessions as well. We try to host a webinar at least once a month. So we look forward to all of you joining us again. And so Krisztina, thank you so much. And please, participants, if you could give us a little bit of feedback, that would be very valuable to us. And Krisztina, again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mark, for this wonderful opportunity. I had a great time. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, everyone, have a great day and enjoy your weekend ahead. Bye-bye.
Bye.